consent that it be considered as read.
Without objection, so ordered. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 90, offered by Mr. Lipinski.
Mr. Lipinski is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you, Chairman Schuster, Chairman Denham, Ranking Member DeFazio, Ranking Member Capuano for this very important pipeline security bill. I don't think most Americans know how many pipelines that they have running through their community, so it's very critical that we do more to make sure that they are safe. Mr. Chairman, my amendment simply calls for a GAO study of federal oversight of pipeline cybersecurity standards. After September 11th, Congress gave the federal government the authority to issue regulations pertaining to the security of critical infrastructure. Instead of issuing regulations, the government deferred to the pipelines industry to develop and adopt voluntary standards. Now, we are continually reminded about the dangers of cyber threats, especially on critical infrastructure such as pipelines. Due to the nature of cyber threats, the technology used to defend against them is rapidly and continually evolving. Because the industry must be able to quickly adapt and respond to this changing environment, voluntary industry standards do make some sense. I want to commend the industry for working with the federal government to develop their standards. However, I remain concerned about the absence of an objective review of those standards and of the federal oversight of their implementation. This amendment would direct the GAO to conduct such a review, to examine existing standards, determine if they are adequate to defend against a potentially catastrophic attack on pipeline infrastructure, and report on the status of the industry's implementation of these standards. We know that the domestic natural gas industry has experienced major cyber attacks. And in 2008 in Turkey, we saw what can happen. A large explosion and ensuing fire of crude oil pipeline that was the result of the deliberate cyber attack that disabled alarms and caused the pipe to overpressurize before corrective action could be taken. But even in the absence of deliberate attack, something as simple as a flawed line of code could have consequences that impact public safety. So ensuring cybersecurity of pipelines clearly is something we need to be concerned about. But how can we verify that the whole industry is adopting best practices if there is no objective review of their efforts? And how do we know that these standards are adequate? Those are the questions I would like the GAO to help us answer. This does not put regulations, new regulations on the pipeline industry. It's simply looking to make sure that the pipeline industry's voluntary standards are adequate and are working. So I would urge my colleagues to support this amendment. But just to save a little bit of time here, I want to, I understand after discussions with the chairman and others that there are some questions here, issues about jurisdiction, although I always think we should fight for more jurisdiction, but concerns about jurisdictional issues on this issue because we're talking about cybersecurity. And so I'd be happy to withdraw this amendment if the chairman would work with me to make sure that something is done to take a look. I would really like to have a GAO study just to take a look to make sure that we are being safe in what we are doing. With that, I will yield back.
Well, I thank the gentleman for withdrawing. I certainly will be willing to work with the gentleman in consultation with Ranking Member DeFazio to talk about and if they say we can't do to pushing this forward and making sure that that we are doing things safe when it comes to cybersecurity. So with that, Mr. DeFazio.
Well, I would concur with the chairman. I think that this may already be under consideration, given what we heard at a hearing last week about cybersecurity issues as relates to critical infrastructure. But this certainly, to be certain that this has been targeted, would be useful.
With that, the gentleman withdraws. Hear the amendment.
I ask unanimous consent to withdraw the amendment.
Without objection, so ordered. With that, any other amendments? Mr. Sanford has an amendment. Mr. Sanford.